Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us for today's webinar. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice at Columbia School of International Public Affairs, and I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. And I'm really delighted today that Columbia can host our colleagues from across the Hudson River at Princeton for a conversation about the excellent Princeton report, really valuable new report, Net Zero America. Net Zero 2050 is the new benchmark for so many countries and companies, reflecting the scientific reality of what's needed to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But while I think many people are saying 1.5 or net zero again and again, we don't often enough stop to really understand what it means to take that kind of goal seriously. What does the economy and the energy system look like in mid-century if we achieve that? What does that world look like? What technologies do we have and which ones do we still need? What does that mean for the kinds of policies that we need to be putting in place today, not just to slash emissions, say by 2030 or 2035, but the steps we need to be taking today to ensure we can continue to slash emissions well beyond that? What are the other non-technical and social barriers to achieving that sort of transition, but also what opportunities might that create in employment or in other ways? And then which communities may be adversely affected by both climate action or inaction, and how do we ensure a transition that not only achieves decarbonization, but is equitable and just in the process? The Princeton report has insights from their modeling on all of these questions. And I've really found an enormously valuable resource to spend time with in the last several months. I've had the chance to talk to Jesse and some other faculty about it, and really delighted we could host several members of the team that wrote the report here for this conversation today. So for those of you joining us, you can submit a question anytime along the way for the panelists by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to have a conversation, see a presentation of highlights of the report, and then I'll have a short conversation with the authors, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So really pleased today to introduce the panelists for this afternoon. Dr. Jesse Jenkins, probably known to many of you, and certainly if you are active on social media in climate and energy Twitter. Jesse is an assistant professor at Princeton with a joint appointment in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and at the Engler Center for Energy and Environment. He's an affiliated faculty member with the Center for Policy Research in Energy and Environment at the Princeton School of Public International Affairs and an associated faculty member at the High Meadows Environment Institute. He has his PhD in energy engineering systems from MIT. And then Dr. Erin Mayfield is a postdoctoral scholar at Princeton, focused on environmental engineering and public policy, did her PhD in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, previously worked as an environmental consultant on natural resource damages litigation and ecosystem service modeling, and has held positions at the US EPA in Congress and the Environmental Law Institute. And Dr. Emily Grubert is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering, and by courtesy of public policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology, she studies how we can make better decisions about large infrastructure systems with a particular focus on societal priorities and energy and water systems in the US. She holds a PhD in environment and resources from Stanford University. So Emily and Erin and Jesse, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to turn it to Jesse and Erin, who are going to summarize a bit about what the US decarbonization challenge looks like, and then turn to Emily and then have a conversation about it. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Jason, for organizing this event and for having us. I'm excited to talk with all of you about the Net Zero America study. I'm going to present a brief overview of the report now. The report in full is over 340 slides, so there's a lot more detail where this came from. And we're excited to have launched today a beta version of a new state-level data website where you can pull up all of the quantitative findings from this study at a state level to find out what a net zero emissions transition means for your backyard across the country, and I'll share a link to that at the end of the presentation. And I do want to say that much of the work I'm sharing here was led by Erin Mayfield, who led all the work on our energy transition employment-related analysis, and air pollution, as well as our thermal power plant transition work. I'm going to do a quick overview just in interest of time myself, and then Erin will join us in the Q&A to talk more in detail about those topics as well. So let me share my screen. So the Net Zero America study we released as an interim report in December of 2015. We're preparing a slight update with a few more graphics and revisions for release in April as a final report, but don't expect any substantial changes. You can access the report here. And I'd like to give it just a bit of an overview of this major 2-year effort that was led by Eric Larson, Chris Gregg, and myself, all faculty, research faculty or faculty at the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. And with a really fabulous team of postdoctoral researchers and collaborators outside of Princeton as well, including Erin, who's with us today to talk about her portion of the work. The study was really motivated, kicked off 2 years ago and was motivated by this increasing focus on the goal of net zero emissions, which had become a talking point in policy circles around the world and for businesses that were increasingly making voluntary pledges or commitments to this goal of reaching net zero emissions. And while there was a lot of talk, it wasn't exactly clear what it would really take to get to that goal. What does it take to build a net zero America? What pathways could the US use to reach those goals? What would it imply for how Americans make and use energy across the country? What will be the implications for lots of other things we care about that are tied up in our energy system, like employment in energy-related sectors or impacts on an air pollution and public health? And of course, what will it all cost? We think that our study is pretty unique and distinctive in the high degree of granularity that it offers. And we moved beyond the sort of high-level modeling outcomes that you see from other studies in this space, including a lot of my previous work that focus on high-level outcomes. And we're trying to work hard to make the outcomes of a net zero energy transition more visceral at a human scale by downscaling detailed results sector by sector, state by state, and year by year to try to understand what this would actually look like for land use, employment, air pollution, infrastructure deployment, and other key questions, including impacts on incumbent industries and the growth of new clean energy industries. And while we were looking out to 2050, the real goal of this work was to try to identify a blueprint for actions we should be taking in the near term over the next 10 years to ensure that we can be on track to that critical goal of net zero by 2050. And when it comes to planning for energy infrastructure or innovation or policy, 2050 might sound like a long way off, but it's really the day after tomorrow. And so taking a look at this full roadmap now is important to align our actions, as Jason said, not just to meet our interim goals in the short term, but to ensure that we are doing all we need to do to develop and improve the technologies we need to take us all the way to net zero and to build the societal consensus and distribution of benefits and costs that's going to allow us to sustain that transition over the next several decades. So we constructed 5 different pathways that employ the same kind of 4 major building blocks, but with different combinations and all of which reach net zero emissions by 2050, all of which use technologies that we fundamentally know how to do today. So we're not counting on some kind of scientific breakthrough or the launch of commercial fusion or other technologies that might be further down the horizon. Relying on technologies that we've proven the engineering out at pilot or commercial scale to date. And we're not also relying on any large scale behavioral changes in these strategies. Now, those could help us reach these goals potentially at lower cost or with less challenge, but we're not assuming that people wholesale adopt vegetarian or low meat diets, or that we see major changes in vehicle miles traveled. Instead, we took the same final energy services demands as in the reference scenario of the annual energy outlook published by the Energy Information Administration, which you can see our reference case here, which is a no new policies scenario to sort of see where we're at with our current set of policies. And then we found a lowest cost path to meet those same energy service demands with different combinations of constraints on the pathways to net zero. So these 5 paths are meant to span across 3 different key axes that we can, or levers that we can pull on to differing degrees to reach net zero. The first axis is the degree of end-use electrification of buildings or vehicles. So the E+ and E- scenarios are respectively a sort of full saturation of electric vehicles and electric buildings for heating and cooking and other things in the E plus case, and then a less high or delayed electrification scenario in E minus, where we push back the saturation point by about a decade. And since most of the adoption curves are nonlinear, they're sort of follow an S shape or a logistic curve, that means that by 2050, we're only at about half of electric vehicles or buildings reliant on electricity or electric heat pumps or other end use electrification. Those two scenarios, as well as the final two, all also constrain the supply of biomass that's available for the model to choose from, which can be a source of carbon neutral or even carbon negative fuels and processes, to ensure no large-scale conversion of lands that are currently dedicated to agriculture or forestry into bioenergy production. And so what we can use then in those scenarios is our existing lands dedicated to corn production for ethanol, which is about 40% of the US corn crop to date. So we could maybe use those lands more effectively for bioenergy production, as well as sustainably harvested waste biomass from agriculture, forestry, and municipal solid waste. So since the low electrification scenario depends more heavily on liquid and gaseous fuels for transportation and heating and industry, we create a middle scenario here, the B plus scenario, which includes a higher supply of biomass, which could help meet that additional demand in the low electrification case for liquid and gaseous fuels. And so that scenario, we relax the constraint on biomass and we use the full billion dry tons estimate from the US DOE and USDA in their billion ton study, which estimates the sort of maximum available and economic potential for biomass supply in the US. So that's the middle scenario. And then the final two scenarios are both variations of our high electrification case, E plus, but they respectively push and pull on the role of renewable energy. So the RE minus case constrains the growth of wind and solar power to no more than the maximum rate of deployment that we've seen to date, which is about 35 gigawatts of combined wind and solar deployment. And so that scenario is meant to capture a case where we see some kind of external constraints on the growth of wind and solar, whether that's due to public opposition or inability to scale transmission lines. And you can see in this scenario, we rely much more heavily, or the model relies more heavily on nuclear power, the orange wedge here, and on carbon capture and sequestration, particularly for natural gas power plants. And then finally, the RE plus case is a 100% renewable primary energy supply, which phases out all fossil fuel use by 2050, as well as nuclear power, and relies overwhelmingly on energy inputs from wind and sun and biomass. You can also see that all of these scenarios capture a very large amount of CO2, about 700 million metric tons at minimum, and either use it, in the case of the RE plus case, where we prohibit geologic sequestration of CO2, or they store much of it in underground sequestration, particularly from biomass sources where the process is a negative emissions process, where we take CO2 out of the atmosphere in plant growth, use that plant growth for fuel, primarily hydrogen production, and then capture and store or sequester the CO2 underground. What we find, and this is the good news, is that all of these pathways are large-scale transformations of our energy system, but affordable transitions to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy. In fact, as a share of our GDP, we find that spending on energy services throughout the transition stays at or below the current share of our GDP spent on energy services, and well below really the historic range that we've seen of between 6 and 8% of our GDP spent on energy services during prosperous periods of American history. And in fact, we can see that during economic recessions or global oil price shocks, as occurred in 2005 and in the 1970s, that share can spike up to 10 to 14% of GDP. In contrast, in each of these pathways, we're seeing between 4 and 6% of GDP spent on energy services, so very in line with recent experience. Now, what that means is that we don't need a World War II style mobilization of 20% of our GDP invested in a clean energy transition. We don't need to bankrupt the economy or sacrifice economically in order to build this net zero future. Instead, the transition is reasonably affordable, and while it would cost more than a do-nothing future in terms of direct energy expenditures, as we'll talk about later, and Erin's work has revealed, there are substantial public health benefits on the order of $2 to $3 trillion of avoided health damages or more, which is on the order of the incremental costs associated with this transition. And furthermore, net zero pathways are much more insulated from price volatility in global oil markets, which, as you can see in the historic time series, can cost us several percentage points of GDP during oil price shocks. So that's the good news. Now on to some of the challenges to building this, this net zero future. The first challenge is mobilizing the substantial amount of capital and as well as human labor, or human capital required to build this net zero economy with an estimated $2.5 trillion of additional capital invested needed over the next decade. We break that down by sources here. You can see in more detail on the report where that investment would go. But while the annual expenditures on energy services remain relatively low, we are transitioning to a more capital intensive energy system where we're investing in upfront in things like wind and solar power and supportive transmission lines or electric vehicles or energy efficiency, which cost a lot upfront in terms of investment, but pay back that investment over time with zero fuel costs in the case of wind and solar, or with fuel cost savings in the form of electric vehicles or energy efficiency. So that means these investments are not costs, they're investments, just that. And we need to mobilize those investments through public policy, with this incremental amount being exactly the increase in investment needed relative to a frozen policy case. What that means is that this chart here is basically our policy to-do list, documenting the range of investments that need to be induced by public policy across each of these sectors. The federal government could spend this money directly, that's one way to do it, but they also could subsidize a portion of the investment to induce the remainder from the private sector, or they can enact regulations and standards that ensure this kind of investment is forthcoming. Either way, we need something to touch each and every one of these boxes to ensure that incremental investments are made in a net zero emissions pathway. The second challenge is that while aggregate costs are reasonably affordable and are really not a major differentiator between these 5 pathways, there are very significant and real trade-offs between each of these different paths. And so this chart ranks all 5 of the pathways on different ordinal rankings of implementation challenges of different types associated with this net zero transition. And what you can see is that whether it's electrification of end use activities or the amount of solar or wind or nuclear capacity that has to be deployed, or the amount of capital or labor mobilized, there's no one scenario here that dominates all of the others on every path, meaning it's closer to zero, which is the easiest or least challenging on these scales. Instead, we have some fundamental trade-offs where we can rely more heavily on certain strategies and minimize other implementation challenges. But it's not clear today, where we stand now, which of these challenges is more likely to be overcome and which are likely to prove binding at some point. To me, what that argues then is that we need to try to keep all of these pathways open, as many of them as possible, so that as we move forward, if we encounter irresolvable boundaries or barriers on any one of these pathways, or any one of these implementation dimensions, we have somewhere we can pivot to. We have plan B or C ready to go so that we can rely more heavily on other technologies or strategies that may entail their own challenges, but help mitigate or relieve the stress on some of the pathways or implementation scales or challenges that might ultimately constrain or prevent our transition to a net zero future. So that argues for investing now in keeping as many of these options open as real options to increase our probability of success. As an example of what some of those trade-offs look like and the downscaling that we did in the study, we looked extensively at where wind and solar resources might need to be deployed across the country to make this transition. So this map shows our current wind and solar capacity across the United States, as well as our high voltage transmission lines in gray and our urban centers where demand is concentrated. So this is where we stand now. And this is maybe where the system would have to be by 2050 under a least cost deployment strategy that reaches our 100% carbon-free and net zero goals by 2050 in the E+ pathway. As you can see, the huge spatial extent of wind and solar deployment across the United States, particularly wind in the center of the country, but large solar deployment across the Southeast and Southwest, and even up through the Mid-Atlantic. And to support all of this wind and solar expansion and to bring the power from where it's generated to where we need to consume it, we may need to as much as triple the capacity of the high voltage transmission system in the United States. To put that another way, it took us about 150 years to build our current transmission system. Well, if we were to build out the system shown in this chart, it would require building that same amount of capacity over the next 15 years and then doing it again the 15 years after that. So when we start to look at these maps and get a more visceral sense of the scale of the undertaking, it's clear that while this might look like the lowest cost strategy to our model, there are real non-cost related challenges that we would have to overcome to make this strategy a reality. And that's true for all 5 of the pathways, as we saw in the previous chart. If you want to reduce the amount of solar and wind and transmission capacity, that can be done by building more firm low carbon technologies like nuclear or geothermal power. But they would need to scale at unprecedented rates to do that. So we have to build hundreds of gigawatts of new nuclear or gas with carbon capture or geothermal power plants, each with their own challenges and implementations as well. And these are exactly the kinds of trade-offs that the report tries to make more clear and quantitative, as well as visually more visceral through the mapping and downscaling work that we've done. So check out the report for a lot more of these sorts of maps and estimates of the trade-offs. The final point I'll make is that all politics, of course, is local, and we're not going to sustain a transition on the scale and magnitude and pace required to get to net zero unless we have, in effect, a social compact or contract, an agreement that is commonly shared across the country that this undertaking, building a net zero America, is something that we fundamentally need to do, something akin to the nation building projects in America's past. If we can sustain that, it will be because the concentration of benefits and the distribution of impacts and costs are fairly allocated in ways that build and sustain public support and buy-in across the country. And in order to have that conversation at a real scale, in order to move forward in a net zero energy transition, we need to, as researchers, be able to offer granular guidance and decision support tools that speak to politically salient results at a local and tangible scale. And that's exactly what we've tried to do with the Net Zero America study. And of course, we've just scratched the surface with this work. And there's much more research to be done, much more development of tools to help provide the decision support needed at this granular and politically relevant scale. But just as a couple examples of this, and this is work that Erin led and can speak more about in the Q&A, we estimated the overall employment impact by sector, by wage, by experience level, and state by state across the transitions for the E+ scenario in this pathway. What we found is that in aggregate, about 500,000 to 1 million net jobs in energy supply related sectors are created relative to the reference scenario. That means that by 2030 and 2 to 3 million jobs by 2050. What that means is that growth in wind and solar and grid related employment exceeds that of the decline in fossil related incumbent sectors over this transition by several million jobs by 2050. However, that high level finding, of course, masks very significant regional variation in where those jobs are created and concentrated, and significant dislocations and transitions in local economies that have to be managed effectively if we're going to achieve a just transition and also to secure the social compact that we would need to support this transition at scale. And so this mapping, which is based on a least cost pathway, so not the only way in which we could deploy infrastructure across the country, helps us start to zero in and identify where those transitions are most challenging and where benefits are likely to be significant. So you can see places like Nebraska or Missouri or Iowa that become in many ways the energy capitals of the United States in terms of overall employment. While some sectors that are dependent today on incumbent fossil fuels see, at least in the near term, declines in energy-related employment, like in West Virginia. Now, of course, there are also declines occurring already in coal-related employment sectors, and those are projected to continue even in a reference or business as usual type environment. And so this kind of mapping can identify where the benefits and new jobs that are created by a transition to a net zero economy might be able to be directed through public policy and through choices we make as a society to smooth this transition and to replace lost revenues and reinvigorate economies at a local scale. And of course, we should say that there's no reason why the energy sector alone has to address all of these energy transition related impacts on incumbent employment. A broader economic development strategy that boosts economic employment and development in other sectors can also use information from this report on the transition impacts on incumbent sectors to understand where and when we need to focus our impact on regional economic diversification and investment. Finally, a clean electricity system that involves retiring coal-fired power plants, building clean electricity sources, and electrifying vehicles and end-use heating in buildings will deliver significant improvements in air quality and public health improvements across all states. So this also is work that Erin led, modeling the detailed air pollution implications at a county level of this net zero emissions transition. And so here you can see today the impacts across the country, the premature deaths or mortalities caused by coal plant pollution on the top and motor vehicle pollution on the bottom in 2020. By 2050, in the high electrification E+ scenario, these two major sources of mortalities would be virtually eliminated, saving between 200,000 and 300,000 premature deaths between now and 2050, which just in simple monetized terms, using the kind of basic value of statistical life used in EPA proceedings, is on the order of $2 to $3 trillion in damages due to premature mortalities alone. And we're working now to estimate also the impacts on hospitalizations, on lost labor productivity due to sick days, and other impacts of health-related exposures to air pollution, which are also significant. So this is an enormous benefit on the order of several $1 trillion, which is of a similar magnitude as the direct increase in energy expenditure costs relative to the no policy reference scenario. So there are huge benefits here for America in making this transition in terms of public health and the air quality for all of us, for our children, for the air that we all breathe. So finally, I'll just close here and note that just today we launched the beta version of a new website for the Net Zero America study at netzeroamerica.princeton.edu, which also includes a state-level data viewer, which makes all of the granular and detailed quantitative results from across the different parts of the study available at a state-by-state basis across each of the modeled years and for each of the pathways that we've analyzed. So please go check that website out. If you notice things that don't work so well or need to be fixed, please let us know. We just launched this, so I'm sure there's some kinks to work out, but our goal is to make all these findings as transparent and accessible as possible. So please enjoy the website. And Erin and I both look forward to the conversation to follow and to Emily's reactions and thoughts as well. Thanks.
Jesse, thanks so much for presenting that work that you and Erin and so many others did. I really appreciate it. And so I look forward to a conversation about it shortly. I want to turn first to Dr. Emily Grubert, who's going to speak about some of her recent work on net zero emissions targets and implications for retirements. Go ahead, Emily.
Thanks so much, Jason. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation and to hear a little bit more about the net zero efforts. What I'm going to be talking about is an effort that I did last year, essentially looking at some of the implications of actually shutting down the infrastructure that we already have. So essentially where this kind of comes down is that we do know a lot about the infrastructure that we need to stop working. I think Jesse just gave us a great overview of a lot of the types of stuff that we need to build and a lot of the urgency of actually putting that infrastructure together. I think what I want to emphasize a bit is all the stuff that we actually have to close or at least vastly remake in order to see this work. Kind of my central hypothesis, my central thesis here really is that because we know where this infrastructure is, actually facilitating planning and facilitating a just transition can be a lot easier if we start to think about deadlines and we start to think specifically about planning horizons for this infrastructure. So just to kind of give you a bit of an orientation here, I think many of you are probably fairly familiar with the point that most of the US's energy consumption currently comes from fossil fuels. So this is essentially a chart going back to 1950, showing the fossil fuel contribution to the overall energy sector in the United States in blue up on that top bar, and then nuclear in kind of the gray red and renewables in green. And what we're really talking about when we talk about getting to a net zero world is taking those little red and green lines and trading them off for the blue lines. And I think one of the things that we maybe talk less about than the enormous effort that it's going to take to actually build up those systems is that there's kind of a counter effort in actually shutting down the stuff associated with the blue line. I'm going to just talk about electricity today, but this also applies to things like mines, wells, pipelines, refineries, all that sort of thing as well. To kind of orient you directly, and let me talk about this very briefly until I get a little bit more specific. One of the things that I think is really powerful about thinking about the other side of the transition, the sort of deindustrialization part, is again that we actually know where all of this infrastructure is. So what this map is showing, this is an interactive map that's available online. If you want to go play with it, all the little power plant dots are clickable, and you can kind of step through years and see what some of the expected emissions might be. Essentially, because we know where these plants are and because we know a lot of the effects of having these plants operate in terms of how much they're generating, how much CO2 they're emitting, water use, that sort of thing, we can actually get a relatively clear picture of what that system looks like when we start to think about what it means to actually take these plants down. I think one of the really powerful things about a spatial view of this infrastructure, because it is substantial and it's a relatively close match for a population map if you look at this closely, what we see is that there's a lot of individual pieces of infrastructure that have very specific things associated with them that we actually do know already. So again, we know how much they're generating, we know where they are, we know a lot of those very hyper-local impacts that are associated with many of the benefits that we expect along the lines of, reduced emissions, reduced water use, and so on, but also are associated with a lot of the challenges in terms of lost labor, lost tax revenue, that sort of thing. So what this map is showing, I'm going to show an animated version of this in just a second, is essentially not only where all of these power facilities actually are. So using kind of industry standards here, red is natural gas plants, the blacks, browns, and grays are coal plants, and the little green dots are oil-fired units, which are mostly small diesel generators. And so it's essentially showing where all of this infrastructure is and then kind of associating it to the labor that's associated both with operating the plants and with operating the extraction activities associated with the fuel for the plants. So in the golds, you see basically by county penetration of jobs associated with the power plants themselves. The sort of reddish colors in the counties are jobs associated with natural gas extraction. Sort of the blacks and browns in the counties are associated with coal labor. What this actually turns into is something where we can start to think about the lifespan of these facilities and when we might expect them to shut down, even if we hadn't really done anything. I think what I'm about to show you in a second is essentially a picture of what would happen if we assumed that all of these facilities were going to last about as long as facilities of similar types have tended to last. So looking at kind of a mean age on retirement based on historical data, and then really thinking about, when would we have expected this infrastructure to close down anyway? Let me let this run a little bit. What this is essentially showing is that because our infrastructure on the fossil fuel electricity side is already fairly old, what we see is that about 73% of these generators actually do reach end of life by 2035, which is an important deadline in this context because of the Biden administration's goals for full power sector decarbonization by that date. I'm going to let this run a couple of times. This is also posted online if you want to go check it out a little bit more closely. But I think what's really important about this is that we do actually see that there is a pathway not just to building up a new infrastructure, but actually a pathway toward closing the infrastructure that probably needs to close that isn't necessarily as damaging as sometimes I think we hypothesize it might be. So it's actually not the case that we're taking a sort of brand new gleaming fossil fuel infrastructure and having to shut it down immediately and basically pay the costs of doubling our energy system. So kind of paying for what we already have in addition to paying for what's new. A lot of this stuff is actually getting to the point where it's old. That doesn't mean that it necessarily would shut down on its own. And there's a huge role for policy here. And I think essentially what the really, really important opportunity is here is that as we're building up the other system, kind of recognizing that a lot of this system is going to need some explicit support in terms of thinking about when this happens, where it happens, and how it happens is a really key part of an overall just transition. One of the other things that I think is actually quite important about the notion that these facilities have lifespans is that a lot of this infrastructure would have needed to be replaced anyway. So I think particularly when we look at like the EIA's reference case for costs going into the future for the existing system, a lot of the time looking deep into it, we actually have something coming out on this pretty soon, I think. Many of those costs of replacing the older fossil fuel infrastructure systems that we have are not necessarily included in some of those models. So the overall net cost of going to net zero may actually be even more attractive than we think it is. But when we think about what this actually looks like, this is just another view of what these generator retirements might actually mean, kind of looking both at CO2 and a bunch of other things that we care about. And what we see again is largely that there's a pretty clear move toward retirements even without policy. Where the policy role comes in is really starting to say, let's actually just declare when these things are going to close and plan around that and use the time that we have between now and maybe 15 years from now to really say, what does this community need? How are we going to address it? And what types of issues do we need to be conscious of as we close this infrastructure? But as Jesse mentioned, thinking about closing this infrastructure actually is also accompanied by a lot of other environmental benefits beyond greenhouse gases. So when we think about what to actually do about all of this, planning ahead is critical for a just transition. This is something that we know based on prior experience with things like the iron and steel industry, textile industries, and a couple of others where we've seen kind of rapid deindustrialization. To date, the fossil fuel transition that we've seen has largely been one of pretty unplanned transition. So a lot of the time when we see coal mines go out of business or plants shut down or something like that, the workers in the community aren't actually notified until, sometimes as bad as a couple of days or a couple of hours before the shutdown happens. When we look at kind of historical labor demands and historical community demands associated with deindustrialization, something that comes out frequently is this notion that having a little bit more notice up front would actually be extraordinarily helpful in kind of gathering a sense of what needs to happen, what community assets you might have access to, and where you actually need to go ask for help. Because we're talking about timelines kind of along the 2035, 2050 time scale, we actually potentially have the ability to provide people with a decade or more of advance notice. And thinking about what that looks like in practice is something where we do have a couple of examples. The Centralia plant in Washington actually has been one of these that did have many, many years of advance notice as they were thinking about closures. So some of the advantages there are actually pretty important to start thinking about. One other thing on a just transition, just to end on this point, when we think about policy that actually may facilitate some of these closures and facilitate the way that we react to these closures, many of the things that people actually want are things along the lines of securing pensions, ensuring environmental remediation actually happens, basically making sure that people still have access to healthcare, wages, that sort of thing after the plants close. I think as we think about a truly just transition, one of the really challenging things about this conversation often is, why are we only focusing on the fossil fuel workforce? What we see from a lot of political science work and other investigations of these types of procedures is that a lot of the time, actually combining social programs that do guarantee that people will continue to have access to wages, access to healthcare, and access to other social services is enormously useful in making this transition actually work, particularly as we move away from just thinking about power plants to thinking about the much larger overall group of people that are affected by fossil fuel industries, starting to think about universal programs and their potential role in a just transition, I think is a huge part of this conversation that I hope we have. So again, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Emily. That's great. And okay, good to bring you and Jesse and Erin all into the conversation. Thanks so much for sharing your research with us in such a clear and concise way. Really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to turn now to a couple of questions that I'm curious about listening to both of you, and then turn in 15 minutes or so and bring in questions from the audience. So many questions, Jesse and Erin, for what you presented, but can you talk a little bit about the time frame, what needs to happen in the next 10 years, and then what in the 10 years after that? As you know, there's a lot of discussion about, there's a view that like, well, we have the tools we need, we just need to deploy. And perhaps that's true. You tell me what you think when we think about things like electricity, maybe not in other sectors. What do you see happening now, and then what tools are still going to be needed beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that we have all the tools we need to begin this transition at scale and in earnest, but we also have the time, if we use it proactively, to complete the toolkit and develop and improve the technologies we need to get all the way to net zero. And so there's not a tension between deployment and innovation. And in fact, innovation proceeds often through deployment. So the reason we now have cheap wind, solar, and batteries, which are the major component costs of electric vehicles and our primary form of stationary electricity storage now, is because of 2 decades of proactive public policy support, even more than 2 decades, but particularly the last couple decades, a proactive support for the deployment of those technologies, as well as incremental innovation and R&D support. So because we took those technologies when they were expensive alternative energy sources, and we created niche markets with policy, or we subsidized their adoption to make them affordable for private consumers and businesses, we were able to drive what are known as experience curves, or economies of scale in production, learning by doing, and incremental innovations, induced research, all of which combined to make clean energy dramatically cheaper. We saw 90% declines in the cost of solar PV and lithium-ion batteries in rough terms over the last decade alone, and about a 70% decline in the cost of wind power. And so those technologies are now very affordable, along with energy efficiency, and we can deploy those at scale this decade to make substantial and immediate progress in reducing emissions. And at the same time, we have the decade ahead of us to repeat that success at making clean energy cheap with the rest of the technologies we need. And some key ones that show up in our study in a big way beyond 2030 are basically any form of hydrogen production. So that includes gasification of biomass with carbon capture. That includes methane reforming of natural gas with carbon capture, and electrolysis with carbon-free electricity sources. Any form of carbon capture, whether that's on cement plants or industrial facilities or power plants. Direct air capture, which could be an alternative to or supplement to negative emissions from bioenergy if it can reduce the cost. And alternatives for industrial processes that can reduce carbon intensity of industry or can transition, say, steel production from blast furnaces with coking coal to direct reduction of iron and electric arc furnaces. Direct reduction iron would use hydrogen as a reductant instead of coal. Huge consumer of hydrogen from clean sources, but potentially carbon-free way to make steel. So there's a big set of innovations around those hard to decarbonize sectors, also around clean, firm generation technologies that can complete the portfolio in the electricity sector. So we have to deploy what we have and build what we need. And we have the time, I think, to do that. And we outline about $130 billion in proactive investment in what we call option creation investments this decade that would target those areas: clean, firm generation, industrial and power carbon capture, hydrogen production, and industrial processes.
And when you have a high and low electrification scenario, just ballpark, like what share of energy use is being electrified in both of those, and what are the things not being electrified in the difference between the two?
So in the high electrification scenario, by 2030, we would be at or above 50% of new vehicles in all classes would be electric drivetrain. So that includes light duty trucks and cars would be electric vehicles primarily. But medium duty trucks and heavy duty trucks would be a blend of electric trucks and fuel cell vehicles, depending on the usage pattern. Whereas in the low electrification case, we might be only at about 15% of sales by 2030. So I think there's a pretty big range there in adoption. And then again, by 2050, we would be about 95, 96% saturation of on-road fleets where it would be electric by 2050. As well as about 90% of heating of space and water heating in buildings in the high electrification case, but in low it would be only about 50 or 60% of on-road vehicles and buildings. So there's a big range there. What that means is that in any of these scenarios we see more than doubling of electricity use between now and 2050. So about 150 to 170% increase in electricity use, and that's true even in the low electrification scenario unless we assume a lot of biomass, because we've already used all the biomass in the high electrification scenario if we constrain it. And so the only way to get the additional carbon-free gaseous and liquid fuels that we need if we don't electrify end-use activities like heating and transportation is with energy-intensive processes like hydrogen production and direct air capture and Fischer-Tropsch fuels and methanation, these sort of very energy-intensive processes that actually increase the total electricity demand. So a low electrification end-use scenario may actually be a high electricity demand scenario, which is, an interesting.
It's a little counterintuitive. I mean, if I saw your chart earlier, right, it looked like in the low electrification scenario, there might actually have been more renewable
I think that's
generation.
Right, exactly. As overall more electricity production, and I think that's probably more wind and solar as well. And that goes into hydrogen production primarily, but also some direct air capture to supplement the carbon. If you're gonna burn fuels without carbon capture, if you're gonna burn a pipeline gas or liquid fuel like jet fuel without carbon capture, that the carbon in that fuel has to originate in the atmosphere for that to be a carbon neutral process. And there are only really two ways to do that. You can get the fuel from biomass, which absorbs carbon as it grows, or you can get it from chemical or other direct air capture means, which are very energy intensive. And so there you need a lot of either carbon-free heat or electricity inputs or both to do that, and that increases overall demand. It'd be more efficient to just electrify as much as we can.
And I want to turn in a minute to Emily, some of your work, and Erin, the parts that Jesse just presented of what you've been doing. But just to finish on the modeling piece, the debate about how much of the electricity system will or should be renewable, 100% renewables. You mentioned a minute ago, zero carbon firm baseload. And as you said, battery costs have come down significantly. So that helps to use intermittent resources like solar and wind. How do you think about how far renewables will, can, should be pushed, and explain why we need other sources of zero carbon electricity?
So what we find in the Net Zero America study and in a lot of the other work that I've done in other recent, publications, the Berkeley Lab 2035 study or work by Vibrant Clean Energy on these transitions, it consistently is that wind and solar are cornerstones of all of these paths. And that's because they're really the cheapest way we have of making carbon-free electricity. But of course, they're not available all the time, right? They're weather-dependent resources. And so when we have the wind and sun, we use it, it's cheap. And we need to complement the what I call fuel saving variable renewables, because when they're available, we can not use some other more expensive fuel with both shorter duration flexibility resources. I call them fast burst resources that are good for short, sustained, not sustained output like batteries, or demand flexibility. So shifting around when we charge our electric vehicles or our hot water heaters. And those are really good at shifting around supply and demand within the day, like on a several hour time scale. And then clean firm generation is the third leg of the stool. And that is a replacement for the fossil firm generation we have today, which is primarily natural gas and coal-fired power plants, as well as our existing nuclear fleet. We have about 950 gigawatts of firm generation. And those are technologies that are available whenever we need them for as long as we need them, or at least they're supposed to be available whenever we need them, as the Texas experience in February showed. When they fail, that is a potentially catastrophic impact. So we need to make sure they're actually firm. But we need to transition off of those fossil fueled firm resources to clean firm resources in the longer term. We can use natural gas in the near term. Over the next decade, if we don't add significant gas capacity, we steadily reduce the amount of gas burned. But we're going to need to replace all of that capacity. And across all of our scenarios, we see about 500 to 1,000 gigawatts of firm capacity needed. So pretty similar in magnitude to the current fleet of natural gas and coal power plants. So that could be new nuclear power plants or advanced geothermal technologies. It could be natural gas power plants that are converted or built to capture carbon and store it safely. It could be biomass power plants that capture their CO2, or it could be hydrogen fueled combustion turbines. So we could convert our natural gas power plants to be able to burn very high blends, if not 100% blends of hydrogen, which is a very high cost fuel, but would be a very low capital intensive, very low capital cost way to get a lot of firm capacity. And that makes it good for pairing with wind and solar. So we don't use those plants very often. So it's okay that they have a high fuel cost. And because we don't use them very often, it's good to have a low capital cost, because you
might think of that like it's storage, right? It's just longer duration
basically
storage.
Chemical storage in the form of hydrogen. And it's not really dedicated electricity storage. We need a bunch of hydrogen at much larger scale for the rest of the economy-wide, fuel demands. And so we might as well use some of that hydrogen in the power sector, just like we use natural gas today, as a reliable form of fuel. Now you have to have some on-site storage and infrastructure to make it and move it around, and that's a key modeling question. But that looks like it could be a very affordable way to get a lot of firm capacity, along with the other technologies I mentioned. And all of those need further development this decade. And so we have to lean into that and develop those technologies with public policy support now, so that they're ready in the 2030s and 2040s to scale up to that hundreds of gigawatts scale.
The other thing that was interesting looking at the charts you showed was you see oil and gas use fall significantly, but not to zero in a net zero scenario. You just mentioned gas with CCS as one option. I presume with oil, some of that might be products like petrochemicals, and then I guess what's happening there is the model is showing that negative emission technology may actually be the cheapest way to offset or decarbonize sectors where it's just really hard to use something other than oil, like flying airplanes. Is that what your model is showing?
Yes, in all the cases except for the 100% renewable scenario, where we don't allow any fossil fuels by constraint, we do see significant reductions in fossil energy use, basically elimination of coal through 2030, and more substantial reductions in oil and gas in the 2030s and 2040s. But again, not to zero, and that's because there are very hard to abate or higher cost uses of fossil fuels, particularly process heat, so natural gas for process heat, and petroleum products for both petrochemical feedstocks and long distance transport and jet fuel. And so instead of making synthetic fuels to replace them, what the model finds is lower cost is using biomass, gasifying that biomass into a synthetic gas, and taking the hydrogen and using it to displace some of the natural gas we need to displace. So we get a zero carbon fuel out of it. and then sequestering or storing all of the carbon dioxide from the biomass as a negative emissions process that then can offset the direct emissions from fossil fuels. And so you get from the biomass, instead of converting it to a carbon-free fuel, you get some carbon-free gas, hydrogen, and negative emissions that allows you to basically offset the most expensive fossil, liquid fossil fuels. And that ends up being a more valuable use of the biomass than converting it directly to, say, jet fuel or another liquid fuel substitute.
Emily, I wanted to come to what some questions I had about the great work you presented, but I'm just curious if you had any comments, reactions, questions to any of what we just heard from Jesse.
Yeah, I think it's really great to see so many of these efforts actually kind of coming to, I think, as Jesse and others have pointed out, broadly similar conclusions, which is basically we can do this. It's not an impossible task, and it's actually an important thing to do. As Jesse mentioned, I think there's a lot of different pathways that we see going through, what we could actually do, and there are obviously different value systems at play with choosing which one is maybe the one that people want to prioritize. It probably doesn't make sense to try to commit entirely to one right now, but I think things like seeing that trying to shut down the coal fleet as fast as we can makes sense. Like things like that are very consistent across all these scenarios are really encouraging. I think combined with the fact that all this stuff is old anyway, and it's not like we just built it 5 years ago, we have a lot of really important opportunities here.
And in your work showing the timeline for retirements, we think about, if I had asked you a few decades ago what the expected retirement is for, say, a nuclear plant, it might not have been 80 years. So how do lifetimes play out in real life? Like, do they often get extended? What keeps them online past their lifetime versus early retirement? And does that have implications for how we think about the sorts of policies we'll need, in addition to some of the incentives to use different types of energy that we'll come to in a minute, to think about how to make some of these scenarios actually happen in the world?
Yeah, certainly. And I think there's actually some really important resilience implications here too, because one of the things that underpins my work basically is to assume not the lifespan that we tend to design around or the book life or something like that. It's actually just average age on retirement that we've observed for power plants, power generators with the same fuel and the same technology, in this case between 2002 and 2018. So that's often actually beyond what we would consider to be book life. A lot of these plants do last a long time. I think what's actually kind of interesting about it, though, when we think about policy and some of the risks here, is that because that's an average, and because when we think about actually trying to set retirement deadlines with policy or something like that, it's often easy to miss how big the standard deviations on these kind of historical shutdown dates are. So I think what we see is that not only do we have a lot of plants that are well beyond their kind of typical lifespan, but there are a number of actually pretty big units that theoretically could close down well in advance of what we expect, partially because they do, these are physical infrastructures. They have parts that are moving and stuff happens. Sometimes you can't get the part that you need, and it doesn't make sense to try to keep the plant online. There's kind of this combination of, what do we actually want to try to keep online, and this kind of background risk of, if we're assuming typical lifespan, we actually have to acknowledge that there may be some that just break. And so thinking a little bit about how we make sure that the new infrastructure is actually matching up temporally with the old infrastructure closing. We can decide when we want these things to close, but that's not necessarily always going to align with when it comes time to close them. Some of this stuff has been driven by policy, but occasionally, yeah, like we've seen nukes in this situation where you do see stuff just kind of go offline forever when you weren't planning on it. And so I think we do need to think a little bit about that, given that this infrastructure is aging.
And I think what Jesse's modeling shows, and Erin's modeling, is we actually want those nukes to stay open a bit longer if you're going to kind of hit these targets for net zero electricity, right, Jesse?
Sorry, say that again.
I was just commenting on the role of nuclear, which I think your modeling shows is actually pretty important, not to dig the hole deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And that's pretty consistent across other studies as well. So as Emily's saying, there are some of these things that are starting to emerge as very robust strategies. So retiring the coal fleet, maintaining the existing nuclear fleet wherever that is safe to do so. So obviously safety remains paramount, but wherever regulators deem that those are safe to operate, they are by far the most cost-effective way to get clean, firm capacity. So it would be a shame to have to basically run twice as fast just to make progress, rather than use the existing nuclear fleet as a foundation to make more rapid progress in fossil energy retirements. When we're done with the fossil energy phase out, then we can revisit the role of nuclear, I would argue, if folks have strong views on that. But I think that's the right order of operations, and you see that, from a lot of modeling. Some other things like the big role of electrification, energy efficiency, wind and solar. Again, those all are consistent, and you can debate, is it 70% wind and solar or 80 or 50, but it's a lot more than today, which is about 9 or 10%. So we know we can cost effectively sort of and robustly put the pedal to the metal and see how quickly we can deploy wind and solar. And it's unlikely that the barriers there will be cost. The barriers more likely will be, how quickly can we find sites for this, wind and solar? How quickly can we extend wind and transmission lines? Things like that are kind of non-cost related barriers for wind and solar scale up.
Yeah. Emily, do you, in your work, just talk a little bit about how much of this is really, sharply shifting what would happen just with the normal lifespan of these things, and what the role for policy is when one thinks about early retirement? Is this, we'll come to the worker transition in a moment, but just in terms of the policy that would create the incentives for early retirement of infrastructure, is it, the same thing that happened with coal plants in the US? If you have the economic incentives through a carbon price or anything else, or, the same way cheap renewables and cheap gas shuts some old coal plants down, or is there a different or stronger role for policy you think is needed?
Yeah, and honestly, I'd argue that a lot of this stuff probably isn't early retirement, especially when you're kind of pegging it to historical lifespans. I think that's one of the really important things of looking at how old the infrastructure actually is. Because of that, I think the role of policy is actually a little different than we tend to talk about, largely in the sense that we actually need people to be warned that this is happening, maybe. So instead of just letting it happen, which again, like people find out that their plant's closing down basically because they get fired one morning. We've seen this happen repeatedly. We've seen it particularly in the coal industry. I think a lot of us would probably argue it's a bit too late to make this a truly better outcome in the coal industry because so much of it has already kind of started to go that way. But as we think about the much bigger infrastructures associated with the gas system and the oil system and so on and so forth, like really trying to use policy as a way to make sure that people know this is coming and can plan for it, I would argue is probably more important than the aspect of it of forcing stuff to shut down early in some ways.
Okay. And what are there's been a lot of talk for a long time, not just in response to this transition, but impacts of globalization and decline of labor unions. That we have communities that are on net free trade helps everyone, but there are communities that are harmed, and we just need the winners to compensate the losers, and policy can figure that out. Well, policy is not great at figuring it out and hasn't been that successful in the past. So can you speak about what you have seen are the most effective public policy investments for communities that are dependent on these plants?
Yeah, and I think in general, I should come out very explicitly to say I'm a big proponent of universal programs in these areas, because part of the reason why it's a problem when people lose their jobs suddenly is, because healthcare is tied to employment, pensions are tied to employment, a lot of other things that actually keep communities going tends to be associated with these big facilities. So thinking about universal programs, not just as a pathway for the fossil fuel retirement system, but actually also for, the negative impacts of climate change itself, the negative impacts of industrialization, like the net zero report shows, like we got to build a lot of stuff. Not everyone's excited about that. I think universal programs are particularly valuable because it means that we're not redesigning the system every single time, and still at the end of the day, you're prioritizing people. That said, I will quickly make my argument for why it does matter a little bit that we actually focus explicitly on fossil fuel workers in this case. And I think one of the really important things in that regard is not necessarily that many people. It's a highly concentrated group of people, certainly. But at the end of the day, when we're thinking about what this transition actually looks like, essentially you at some level have the government saying we're eliminating an entire industry, but oh, by the way, on our way to eliminating that industry, we really need you to stay on the job until we're absolutely sure we don't need you anymore. And so there's this kind of combination of, like, for the good of society overall, this whole thing needs to go away. However, like, until that very, very last day, you actually still need somebody operating the gas plant. You need somebody operating the pipeline, all those sorts of things. And so really trying to make sure that those temporalities match up while providing people a future, really, and also making sure that people kind of have an understanding of where they're going. I think there is an argument for focusing specifically on some of these communities in a number of ways.
And Erin, can you talk a little bit about the nature of the jobs being created? I mean, the idea that in a transition, inevitably, there's going to be reduced employment in some sectors, lots of new economic opportunities created in others. Whether that's a satisfying answer for, a 50, 55-year-old worker in the coal sector is a difficult question. We should talk about it. But just in terms of the physical location of where you see jobs being created in the net zero transition. Where are they? What types of jobs are they in terms of income and benefits? And do they overlap with where some of these retiring plants are?
Mm-hmm. So certainly there are some spatial complementarities in addition to occupational complementarities. For example, with respect to declining oil and gas jobs, there's some complementarities with potentially future carbon sequestration injection jobs. You might also see there's programs now that they're funding to try to re-employ fossil oil and gas workers related to well closures, but that is not sufficient to deal with job losses in these declining fossil fuel sectors. We see increasing employment in solar and wind supply chains, grid-related jobs. Those are the largest resource sectors that we see over time. But of course, there's not perfect temporal and spatial complementarity. And as you say, at the worker level, the person level, there's no guarantee that these workers are going to transition. And so with respect to job quality, there's a lot of discussion regarding the relatively high wages paid to oil and gas workers, and to the extent that that workforce is willing to accept jobs within the solar and wind industry, which may not pay as much. I think there's a lot of different types of workers employed within these sectors that we don't appreciate. It's not everyone in the oil and gas or related to the oil and gas sector is being paid a high wage, right? And so I think we have to realize that, and that's also true for solar and wind. There's a lot of income inequality within these individual resource sectors. So there is the potential for policy that corrects for some of these wage differences, for example, having prevailing wage policies or other types of supports for these newly created low carbon jobs to make them much more attractive for the workforce. But it's also important to realize that these large labor transitions are going to require much higher demand in energy related jobs. And so this could potentially be a transition risk as well, right? So it's not solely this great story of job creation, it's also about ensuring that you have a workforce that is appropriately trained and in addition, actually deriving benefits for local communities as well.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, just to emphasize that we often in the political discourse in particular, see direct job creation as a political plus. And to some degree, that's of course going to be true. But it also is a potential transition bottleneck if you need to rapidly scale up, the workforce in a particular sector that requires proactive effort and training and attraction of talent to that industry, especially if we want to see the improvements in labor productivity that are important to reductions in cost, for technologies over time. So, we ranked labor mobilization as one of the implementation challenges on that spider graph. We also have another one that shows benefits and impacts. And there it's, it can be ambiguously seen as a cost or an impact, a benefit or an impact too. And so I think it's important to see the scenarios through both lenses. These can be important engines of economic development and employment in certain communities, but they can also be, the labor mobilization is every bit a challenge as capital mobilization, given the scale and growth of these new sectors that we're looking at.
What is the, I'm thinking about the intersection between these two studies we just presented, and what does it tell you, Jesse, about the potential for lock-in of infrastructure and how to think about medium-term goals with long-term goals, particularly when it comes to things like natural gas build-out?
Yeah, I think natural gas, in particular natural gas power plants and pipelines, are one of the real key questions that we face right now. Our models run with perfect foresight. The Net Zero America Study model runs with perfect foresight to 2050. And so it knows that if I build a power plant, in 2040, I'm not gonna be able to use it in 2050 unless it's zero carbon, And so what we see in that transition with that kind of foresight is really not much, if any, increase in installed natural gas generation capacity nationally. There might,
starting now.
Starting basically now. So we're about flat
now.
in natural gas fire capacity, maybe a small increase in some scenarios, a small decrease in others. Now, certain locations, especially those that are going to see rapid coal retirements, may need to add new natural gas capacity in the short run to manage, reliability needs given the large concentration of coal retirements in certain regions. But that means other regions across the country may actually be able to retire older natural gas plants and not replace them. So on net across the country, we're kind of flat. If you didn't run with perfect foresight, if the policy signals are not clear and not sending those signals to investors now, it's very likely that the large scale deployment of a retirement of about 250 gigawatts of coal capacity could lead to an equal scale deployment of new natural gas in the short run, because there really aren't other viable clean firm technologies ready for widespread use now. So if you're going to retire a coal plant, the only firm option you have to replace it with is a natural gas plant. So we do need some policy coordination and some signals, both to sort of pull forward the deployment of clean firm capacity and drive its innovation proactively, and also to say, let's try to get as far as we can with the existing gas fleet, which is already built and already partially amortized. And if you are going to build any new capacity, it should be under pretty clear conditions. One, that it's helping retire a coal-fired power plant and reduce emissions. Second, that you're amortizing it over an appropriately short time frame. So if you build a power plant that comes online in 2030, you shouldn't be planning to rate base it for 40 years, right? That's not going to be fair to your customers, and it's not going to be the right cost benefit analysis to run. And that it's needed for reliability needs, that you can't get the capacity you need from a combination of demand flexibility and storage and renewables in the short term. So there are going to be some places where that's true, but in general, I think the burden of proof, for new gas infrastructure needs to be pretty high. There's a similar challenge, and Erin looked at this a bit in her work on investments in gas distribution networks, which I'd love you to comment on, Erin, in terms of the sort of trade-off of, we want to reduce methane leakage in the pipeline networks. That might mean a lot of new investment. On the other hand, we might see dramatic declines in how much we use gas distribution. So that's another, I think, key challenge. Erin, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. So we've seen some recent rate cases based on, of course, safety, but also part of it, what people are talking about is you want to improve these distribution systems and build out new parts of these distribution systems, and on the basis of reducing methane emissions, but it's not considering kind of the long-term net zero type scenario. And some of these regional transitions, the mindset hasn't been that net zero for a long time, right? And so now we're kind of suddenly shifting. In some of these regions, those conversations aren't happening at all, and we're still building out new distribution systems, and the life of those payback periods are on the order of 50 years. And so how do we think about that in terms of a 30-year transition?
Allie, do you have comments or thoughts about that and how one thinks about the conditions in which you think about infrastructure investments and permitting today?
Yeah, and I think one of the things when we really look at trying to build out the new zero carbon system that we talk about a lot is the integrated supply chain issues that we see there. Like, we're going to need a lot of mining and stuff like that. So there's a bit of a conversation about that type of mobilization and, again, industrialization associated with these pathways. I think a lot of the time we actually tend to talk less about, again, the deindustrialization implications of a lot of what we're trying to assume. So one of the things that I think comes up that is a bit complementary to this question of, should we put hundreds of millions of dollars into the pipeline system, stuff like that. If you do kind of rely on natural gas as cleanish firm generation for a while, or as clean as you can get it firm generation for a little while, what does that imply about the upstream infrastructure that you need to be preserving? And like, who's running it? Are we still making petroleum engineers? Is that a thing we're still doing? And like the vast amount of infrastructure that actually supports these systems. I get a little nervous sometimes when I see modeling reports that basically say we can rely on natural gas fired generation being available at the same cost as we have it today when things are running at 5 or 6% capacity factors sometime in the far future. I think, like Jesse says, there's a lot of actual, I guess, there are situations where we really do need to be able to say, yes, we're willing to pay a lot more for this because it provides such a value to the system. But I think we need to be a little bit more honest with ourselves about the fact that this is probably not going to be the kind of thing where you can just rely on the system that already exists being available at the cost where it exists into the long term.
I did not note 10 or 15 minutes ago that it was the point to switch to audience questions, but although I have done that and switched to audience questions, so that one, for example, on infrastructure build out was coming in, and I think it was also the point at which I would have told people, now we're switching to audience questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat, but there are so many in the chat that I would be lying to you if I said we would get to probably additional ones beyond what's there, and I'm trying to work my way through as many as possible in the 20 minutes or so that we have left. So I'm going to try to, but I see a few broad themes emerging in the questions, and that's what I'm going to try to put to both of you. One of them, Jesse, is about how people think about energy consumption and lifestyle. Do we need to think about not flying, about not consuming in the same way in the scenario? Do your scenarios account for any of that? There was a particular question about how your scenarios account for energy efficiency and whether they are cost optimized while energy efficiency is effectively an input to the analysis. So if you could talk a little bit about what the implications of your scenarios are for the way we live our lives, for do we need to think differently about consumption and particularly about efficiency?
So we set out in this study to take pretty conservative assumptions about how those factors would change. So we, as I mentioned at the outset, make no changes in the level of energy services demanded. So the square footage of buildings that need to be heated, the amount of stuff that people buy, the vehicle miles traveled or trip miles, seat miles on airplanes. So we're not assuming any large scale behavioral change. And on the energy efficiency side, we assume not the fastest ever, but an increase in the rate of industrial energy productivity, which is a big driver, although there are potential rebound effects that we don't account for in the industrial sectors or other sectors. And then we assume basically at the end of the life of an appliance or other durable good like a vehicle, it's replaced with the most efficient option in the model catalog. So we're all kind of on the Energy Star path in terms of our devices. And so over time, we see improvements in energy efficiency. The one thing we don't include, which other more energy efficiency forward strategies have, is deep retrofits of existing buildings. We assume that new buildings are constructed to very high efficiency standards, but that existing buildings are not retrofit substantially. They're switched over to heat pumps and clean cooking, electric cooking, but they're not deep building shell retrofits. And that's because those are much more disruptive to people's lifestyles and in your home if you've ever had a insulation put in or other things like that. And they potentially are much higher cost implementation programs. So we were sort of took that as that could be another measure you could do, and we have some sensitivities that look at that, but that was not our core assumption. And so all of that was meant to be fairly conservative on the behavior change side, not because we want to predict that or don't think that behavior change is helpful, because we wanted to start by trying to see if we just continue with the reference scenario demands without requiring these large changes, can we still see a viable and affordable path to net zero? And indeed, we could find 5 of them. Of course, they have major implementation challenges, as you saw in our slides, and you can see more in the report. And so the degree that we can reduce the infrastructure we have to build by being more efficient or changing behavior to reduce energy services demand, then that can help make the implementation challenges less significant. And I would just highlight maybe 2 of the most important ones, or maybe 3. The energy efficiency in vehicles and buildings is less important in terms of cost because we electrify all those sources and we have alternative, low carbon, low cost options. The biggest bang for the buck in terms of cost savings is in industrial efficiency, because a lot of that and a lot of the final demand for liquid and gaseous fuels is in industry. And then aviation and travel, if we can reduce vehicle miles traveled, that reduces the amount of fuels we need, that it reduces the upstream infrastructure. And then one that we don't really get into quantitatively, but we touch on in the agriculture and forestry section, is reductions in meat consumption. So if we do see, lower meat diets, people shifting to the Impossible Burger, other meat substitutes, not pure vegetarianism, but just reductions in meat consumption, that has huge implications for land use and agriculture that could lead to, big changes in, globally as well in the amount of land use for agriculture converted over time. So those are sort of big, bang for buck kind of behavioral changes, but none of those are baked into our modeling. We can, get there even if those don't proceed at large scale.
Yeah, we can get there, meaning from a technical modeling standpoint.
Yes,
I want to
should
come
be
back
clear,
to your
yes.
I want to come back to your spider
Without
chart,
significant cost, yeah, but not
well,
necessarily prediction.
yeah, without significant cost. That's a really important point. Like, this is doable, but it goes beyond sort of, is it cost effective and technically possible to design this sort of system, to how do we think about the challenges to do it in the real world. And that's why I thought your spider chart showing what the trade-offs are was really interesting, in a really helpful way to frame it. And there were several questions along those lines, particularly around how do we think about addressing issues as we head up to a major discussion about an infrastructure bill and the trillions of dollars in Washington on permitting and siting, and just how difficult it is to build things in this country. So I'm just kind of curious, it's almost a subjective question, but when you look at the world as it is, and anything we're doing, any of these scenarios is not easy, it's going to take work, although it's doable. But how do you layer on, what the practical challenges are, the non-technical barriers, and does that sort of, I don't want to ask you to, or I mean, do you have a sense of one of these scenarios is going to be more likely than others, driven not only by cost and technical issues, but by some other issues as well?
I don't have a prediction there. I think it's, I have my priors, but I don't think they're any more useful than anybody else's. So I think what, at a high level, I would say that it's unlikely we're going to see this kind of transition unless we have a sort of national, not universal, unanimous consensus, but some kind of, social compact that this is a mission that America is going to take on, right? That we are going to build a net zero emissions, low pollution, more just energy infrastructure. And that's part of our economic development strategy. That's part of a nation building project for the 21st century. If we do that, I think that will change the way in which we approach infrastructure in the country. If we continue the way we have for the last several decades, where we're sort of, eating off of the seed corn of prior generations' investment in infrastructure in this country, I don't think we're going to get anywhere close to the pace required here, right? And so it does change, I think, take a change in how we address and see infrastructure investment and build out in the country. There's a lot of overdue investment. I know Emily and Erin have both worked on this as well. A lot of overdue investment just in our current infrastructure that needs to be fixed. But we also need to build a lot more new things. And that isn't something we're very accustomed to, large scale infrastructure projects. So if that remains the sort of approach, I do think we're going to fall very short of the pace here. And so that's where I think the work on the concentration of benefits and costs and really understanding, what the trade-offs and concentration of benefits looks like is where we might be able to sell that vision, right? That this is something that can deliver near-term economic renewal in certain parts of the country, can, strengthen the tax base in certain places. It can reduce air pollution and health impacts that we all care about. Those kinds of things can kind of, build that sense of buy-in. But I'd also be curious what either of my esteemed colleagues here think about how we're going to.
Yeah, I was going to ask Emily if she had anything, or Erin, to build to that. I mean, Emily, your work focuses heavily on some of these political economy challenges and what's needed to address them.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I'll defer to Erin, though. I know she was about to say something.
Like, I would agree with Jesse that it's this larger social compact, but I also think it's beyond creating the benefit story, and it's actually delivering those benefits and keeping trust at the community level over time. And I think that's a big part of the challenge going forward.
And I think what I was going to say, I've done a lot of kind of more sociological work at the community level, largely focused on fossil fuel extraction. But I think one of the things that we see very much as we think about justice and as we think about a just transition on the industrialization side as well, is that a lot of what's been absent in our infrastructural development in the past has been consent. And that's actually something that's enormously, enormously difficult to think about in the context of trying to build out these systems as fast as we're talking about, because I think a lot of the time when we think about actually how much steel needs to go into the ground and how much of this infrastructure actually needs to get built, there's not necessarily a lot of thought about the fact that, some communities are going to say no, and some of them probably have very good reasons to do that. I think, as Jesse points out, like creating, and as Erin points out as well, creating not just a narrative of how this is going, but actually genuine benefits that are part of a social contract, which again, I think kind of bolsters the argument for more universal programs to kind of make sure that people know that they're not going to be left behind, is a huge, huge part of this. But I think especially talking to a lot of my sociologist friends, one of the things that's very interesting to watch about renewable energy build out is that some of the same types of reactions that we saw during the fracking boom have been emerging in a lot of these communities, where there was a little bit of a hypothesis that maybe there was widespread opposition to industrialization largely because it was fossil based. Like, no, you still get traffic, you still get massive landscape changes. And I think what a lot of more recent work has shown too is that people do tend to be to react to projects at the project level as opposed to the size of the project necessarily. So when we think about, what I showed was basically we need to shut down 10,000 fossil fuel generators. We probably need to build, 50,000 new generators, depending on whether you think one turbine or one panel is, how many units is that basically. But like, there's a massive amount of consent that actually needs to come into play here. And so I think to kind of round this back to maybe where we started here, thinking very deeply about how we provide energy services at lower energy intensity, and really thinking about, there might actually be very good arguments for deep building retrofits that are more around the point of, we're going to get to the point where we have poor ore grade, essentially, for a lot of these projects, either in the sense that the resource isn't that good or people don't want it there, this type of thing. How do you avoid those marginally and more difficult projects later? Some of that is, increasing resilience of people to be in their houses, decreasing their costs, like all these other benefits that we tend to get as ancillaries with some of these building retrofit questions. Doesn't mean it's cheap, but it might be cheaper than like not being able to do this at all, essentially.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we're going to run out of time quickly, but there are a lot of questions about policy, which is good because we're a policy center. We've talked already about some of the policies needed to support and help communities transition, but there are a lot of questions, Erin and Jesse, about sort of the impacts or policy implications or the impacts of policy on the modeling results you showed around how a carbon tax would affect your results or others. And I presume the answer is partly, this is what happens as a result of policy choices that are made, as well as technological innovation and the rest. But talk about what policy takeaways, how does different policy choices, whether it's a clean electricity standard or a carbon price or other things entirely, how do they inform your analysis, and what does your analysis tell us those policies should look like?
So I guess I would say we were pretty not agnostic, but arm's length about the policy mechanisms needed to get here. Our goal with the net zero study was to provide a to-do list for policymakers, but not the menu of options or the plan for the policy side of things. The reality is there are a lot of different ways to tackle each of these policy challenges. And so focusing on the objective, I think, can help us clarify, okay, well, these are the set of policies that actually solve the problem. And these are not. And we're actually starting a project now that Erin is working with me on as well to basically turn the same toolkit into evaluating policy proposals. So as policies come out of Washington and other stakeholders, we can run them through the same kind of modeling framework and score them against the net zero transition pathway, particularly for the next decade, and sort of say, all right, well, this one gets you, 50% of what you need in the power sector, and this one, gets you part of what you need on this other component. And then also to look at the distribution of costs and benefits associated with those policies, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive the politics and the decision making. So I don't have the answers in terms of like, this is the slam dunk set of policies. I would point folks to, and I'll drop a link in the chat here for everybody, to a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report that I was a part of the committee on, which does include 35 or so groupings of policies that address many of these issues, and much of which, about half, are focused exactly on these socioeconomic transition challenges, because we recognize that you can drive the technology investment, but if you don't address provide the policy mechanisms to address the socioeconomic transition, it's not going to happen at all, and we're not going to sustain that. So I'll just point to that report as shorthand and say check that out for much more. In general, what we say is basically tackle each sector by sector, because the technological reality, the political reality, and the pace at which those industries can transition is different, and you need policies that are responsive to all three of those factors. And so we do recommend an economy-wide carbon price in that report to help make the whole thing more efficient, but not to do the bulk of the work. There you do need to be attentive to the sectoral issues, and then a whole suite of policies that address the socioeconomic transitions as well. So all of that, I think, is key to to getting the job done. And at the end of the day, I come back frequently in our briefings to that area plot I showed of the $2.5 trillion incremental investment, because what we need are policies that check or affect each of those boxes. And that could be any number of different packages of policies to mobilize that capital.
Erin, can you flesh out a little bit sort of, what Jesse suggested there with the socioeconomic factors and implications? If you think about how to design policy and the choices you make, what are the metrics by which you evaluate policy choices against? And one is which makes the biggest dent in emissions, which does it at the cheapest cost. But there are other implications for who winners and losers are, and distributional impacts, and who bears the cost of policy, like a carbon price. Who does that fall on? Who pays it? Or other costs that may be imposed by acting or by inaction. How do you think that should inform policy discussions in ways that are maybe not happening enough?
Mm-hmm. So this is a big discussion in Washington right now, in part because of part of Biden's executive order. There's the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of benefits are to flow from public investment in innovation and in infrastructure are to flow to disadvantaged communities. So there's a lot of open questions regarding what that means, what are benefits, and what are disadvantaged communities. And so I think there's a lot of existing computational tools out there that we could be leveraging to look at how, for example, health benefits flow to different communities from closures of facilities, in addition to direct investment and compensation for individuals and communities as well. So I think it's kind of mapping and understanding the multiple types of benefits, and actually who at the community level or different segments of the subpopulation are benefiting as well.
Jesse, there are a lot of questions also about the resources needed, steel, lithium, other metals, to complete this transition. Can you talk about how the study accounted for the increased demand for all of this infrastructure and what the scale of it is? And is that a constraint?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the areas that was on our to-do list that didn't get done, given the scope of the study and the number of people we had to work on it. It was the last one that fell off the to-do list. So yeah, I think there are some significant potential materials supply bottlenecks. I don't think there's any just like raw material limitations that are going to constrain it at a global scale. But as we've seen in other sectors, as they grow rapidly and some of these sectors really expand and take off, you can get at least periodic or temporary booms and busts or supply constraints that could lead to higher prices for some period of time or other things. Generally, what we see is when those prices go up, we see innovation that reduces the intensity of use for those materials, as well as new supplies coming online. So those tend to be only temporary bottlenecks, but they could be important dynamics that we've not adequately explored in the report so far.
Great, thanks. I wish we had several more hours, because there's a ton of really good questions in here. I tried to group them into some broad buckets as best as I could. But we are out of time, unfortunately, and want to be respectful of how much time Jesse and Erin and Emily have already given us to share their really interesting work with us and help us understand a little bit better. So just thanks to all of you for being with us today. And thanks to you, our audience, for tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event, Bridging the Congressional Divide, Bipartisan Action on Climate Change, will be held this Thursday, March 18th at 3 p.m. It's a conversation between Representative David McKinley of West Virginia and Representative Kurt Schrader of Oregon, sponsors of a new bill in Congress. For a full calendar of all upcoming events, please visit us online at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you again soon at upcoming events. And please, just in a virtual round of applause, join me in thanking Jesse, Erin, and Emily for being with us today. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Goodbye.